The stars had never refused the hegemony before. In 11,000 years of expansion, across 47 absorbed species and countless dead civilizations whose names now existed only in footnotes of imperial archives, the galactic hegemony had never encountered a world that said no. They didn't expect one now. Why would they? The sensor readings were almost insulting in their mediocrity. A small, water-drenched rock orbiting an average yellow star on the unfashionable outer edge of the spiral arm. Its inhabitants had only recently stopped killing each other long enough to build primitive orbital stations. They still used chemical propellants. They still breathed unfiltered atmospheric gas. Their most powerful weapons split atoms, a technology the hegemony had considered quaint for 6 millennia. Fleet Admiral Vulcan Thesis stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and barely suppressed a yawn. He was a decorated veteran of 32 absorption campaigns. He had watched gas giant civilizations fold in 3 days. He had accepted the surrender of a species that communicated through bioluminescent skin patterns, and he had done it before breakfast. This assignment, formally designated Absorption Protocol 7714C, Target, Sol III, was the kind of posting given to admirals who were being respectfully nudged toward retirement. A reward mission. A formality. The kind of thing you completed between more interesting assignments and mentioned briefly at dinner parties. His fleet was 200 warships strong. It was, by hegemony standards, a modest show of force. He could have brought fewer. He brought 200 because the regulations required a minimum and because symmetry pleased him aesthetically. The fleet crossed into the outer system at 600 Standard Time. Vulcan ordered shields lowered. There was no point projecting an aggressive posture at primitives. It tended to cause panicked nuclear launches which were messy and tedious to clean up. Better to appear as a natural phenomenon on their instruments. A slow, majestic arrival. Overwhelming but calm. He sent the standard absorption transmission on all frequencies, the hegemony's universal greeting, translated into every electromagnetic band humanity used, offering them the standard terms, integration, survival, and the honor of contribution to galactic civilization. It was a generous offer. Most species, when they saw 200 warships filling their sky, accepted gratefully. Vulcan leaned back in his command chair and waited for the response. The response did not come. What came instead was silence, but a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of a primitive civilization scrambling to comprehend what it was seeing. This was a silence with texture. His communications officer, Yenth, tilted her crest slightly and reported that human electromagnetic traffic had not panicked, had not surged with the expected chaos signatures of a population seeing its first alien contact. Instead, the traffic had gone very quiet, very organized and very purposeful, shifting frequencies in patterns Yenth couldn't immediately decode. "They're talking to each other," she said carefully, "just not to us." Vulcan found that mildly interesting. He ordered the fleet to hold at Saturn's orbital path and wait for a response. 3 hours later, the first of his ships stopped transmitting. It was a perimeter vessel, designation IV-7, stationed at the edge of the formation. Its last transmission was routine standard systems check, all clear, then nothing. Vulcan assumed a technical malfunction, equipment degraded. It happened. Then IV-9 went silent. Then IV-3. Then 6 ships simultaneously in a pattern that made Yenth stand up from her station, her crest fully raised, her voice unusually tight when she said, "Admiral, the silences are not random." Vulcan sat forward. Over the next 40 minutes, his 200-ship fleet lost contact with its own vessels in a sequence so precise, so geometrically deliberate, that it could only be described as one thing, a message. Someone was turning off his ships one by one, in a spiral pattern from outside to inside, like a hand slowly closing into a fist. He gave the order to retreat at full power. The Eternal Dominion made it 11 seconds before every system on the bridge went dark. Back on Earth, in a reinforced mountain facility in the Swiss Alps that officially didn't exist, Captain Elena Vasquez stood before a wall of screens displaying the last known positions of 200 alien warships, and said nothing for a long moment. She was 44 years old, former commander of the submarine USS Resolute, recruited 18 months ago into the Unified Earth Defense Command when the first long-range anomaly readings had started coming in from the outer system. She was not a scientist. She was not a diplomat. She was someone who had spent 20 years learning how to keep a crew of 130 people alive in the most hostile, silent, pressurized darkness on Earth. and someone had decided that particular skill set was exactly what humanity needed right now. She looked at the screens. She looked at what her team had just done. Then she turned to her chief engineer, a former CERN physicist named Dr. Amara Osai, and said, "How many of them are still alive in there?" Amara checked her readouts. All of them, every single crew member. Ships are disabled, not destroyed. Life support is running on isolated power. Elena nodded slowly. Good. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold. Because whoever sent them is watching, and I need them to see exactly what we did and exactly what we chose not to do. She took a sip of cold coffee and stared at the screens. Outside, the solar system was very, very quiet. In 11,000 years, the hegemony had never been answered like this. In 11,000 years, no one had ever turned off their fleet, kept every soldier alive, and then simply waited. Elena Vasquez waited. The hegemony Senate chamber on Varath Prime was a structure built to intimidate. It rose 900 meters from the planet's surface, its walls lined with the carved representations of every species the hegemony had ever absorbed, faces frozen in expressions that the hegemony's architects had chosen to interpret as gratitude. The chamber floor could hold 12,000 senators simultaneously. Today it held all of them, and the noise they produced was not the sound of governance. It was the sound of fear trying very hard to disguise itself as outrage. Supreme Commander Draxus of the High Caste stood at the central podium and let them exhaust themselves before he spoke. He was old by any species standard, 340 standard years, and he had learned early that powerful beings made their worst decisions when they were afraid and in a hurry. He waited until the chamber quieted by sheer exhaustion, then tapped his podium once. 200 ships, he said. Gone, no distress signals, no debris, no enemy signatures, no radiation blooms, no wreckage. He paused to let that sink in. They simply stopped. The silence that followed was different from the earlier noise. This one had weight. There are, Draxus continued calmly, 3 possible explanations. First, a catastrophic and simultaneous equipment failure across 200 independent vessel systems, which our engineers rate at a probability of 1 in 10 to the 47th power. Second, a natural phenomenon in that star system of a type we have never previously encountered, which is theoretically possible and operationally irrelevant because if such a phenomenon exists, we need to know about it before we send more ships. Third, he paused again. He was very good at pauses. Third, someone turned them off. The chamber erupted again. Draxus waited again. He did not share what was keeping him awake at night, the detail in Admiral Thesis's final partial transmission that his intelligence team had extracted from signal fragments. The shutdown sequence had not been random. It had been patterned, deliberate, mathematical, and worst of all, patient. Whatever had disabled those ships had done it slowly enough to be theatrical, to make a point. The Senate, after 11 hours of debate, voted to send a second force. The second and third armadas, 600 ships total, under Draxus's personal command, officially classified as an investigative and corrective force. In plain language, go find out what happened and fix it. Draxus accepted the command with a formal bow, and one private thought that he kept entirely to himself. We're sending 600 ships to find out what happened to 200. If we're wrong about what's down there, we're not sending enough. If we're right, we're sending too many. 600 hegemony warships moving through deep space created a gravitational signature detectable from several light minutes away. Elena Vasquez picked them up at the edge of the system 11 days before they arrived, which gave her exactly as much time as she needed. She held a briefing in the main operations room at 300. Her senior staff looked exhausted and electric simultaneously, the particular expression of people who had stopped sleeping not because they couldn't, but because they couldn't bear to miss anything. They're sending 6 times the original force, said General Marcus Webb, her Joint Chiefs liaison, spreading his hands over the holographic display. That tells us they noticed, that tells us they're serious, and that tells us they do not as yet understand what happened to the First Fleet. What's the status of Fleet 1? Elena asked. Stable, holding position, all life support nominal. We've been sending them enough power pulses to keep their biological systems running. They can't move, can't communicate, can't do anything, but they're alive and they'll stay that way. Amara Os, I pulled up a schematic. They're essentially sitting in the world's most polite prison. And Fleet 2, Elena asked, meaning the incoming 600. 11 days out, moving in a standard three-column formation which suggests Draxus is experienced and careful. He's keeping his flanks protected and his center heavy. Marcus studied the display. He's not coming in reckless, he's coming in ready. Elena stared at the incoming formation for a long time. Then she said, "Let them get to Jupiter's corridor, then repeat the sequence, exactly as before." "All 600, someone asked. "All 600, she turned to face the room. "But this time, I want them to see us do it. Open a visual channel before we engage. Let Draxus watch what happens. Let him have the full experience of understanding exactly what he's walking into in real time with no ability to stop it." The room was quiet. Dr. Osa raised an eyebrow. "That's psychologically quite cruel, Elena." "It's not cruelty," Elena said. "It's a lesson, there's a difference." She turned back to the screens. "He needs to understand, and he needs to understand it consciously, not just as a data point in a report. I want it in his memory, in his gut, because he's going to go back and talk to the Senate, and I need what he says to be felt, not just reported." 11 days later, Supreme Commander Draxus of the High Caste sat on the bridge of his flagship and watched, on an open channel that had been sent to him without request or explanation, as his 600 ships went dark, one by one, in that same terrible spiral pattern, outside to inside, slow and deliberate and absolutely inevitable, while a human woman with dark hair and tired eyes sat at a communications console and watched him watching it happen. She didn't say a single word. She just watched him, calmly, with the patience of someone who had expected him and prepared for him and was now simply waiting to see what he would do next. Draxus sat very still for a very long time after his screens went dark. Then he said quietly to his bridge crew, all of whom were staring at blank instruments in various states of shock, "Do not touch anything. Do not attempt to restore systems. Do not transmit." He folded his hands in his lap. "We are going to sit here and we are going to think." His tactical officer, a young Vorath named Keys, turned to him with an expression that mingled professional trauma with genuine curiosity and asked, "Sir, what are they?" Draxus looked at the dead screens for a long moment. 11,000 years, he said quietly. 11,000 years and 63 civilizations, and I have never not once been made to feel like the smaller party. He was quiet for a moment more. "That is what they are, Keys. They are the first civilization in the history of this empire that has made us feel small." He unfolded his hands. "And they have still not hurt a single one of us." He stared at the screens. "That," he said, "is the part that frightens me most." High Marshal Saravan did not sleep for 6 days after accepting the command. This was not anxiety. Anxiety was for politicians and economists. Saravan was the hegemony's most decorated military mind, 340 campaigns, 63 absorptions, author of the doctrine of measured force that was taught in every hegemony war academy on 20 worlds. He didn't sleep because he was thinking, and when Saravan thought at a problem hard enough, sleep felt like an insult to the problem. 2 armadas, 800 ships, disabled without a shot fired. Commanders alive, crews alive, ships intact but inert, sitting in the outer reaches of a primitive star system like toys arranged by a child who wanted to make a point. He spread the data across his study walls and stared at it the way a surgeon stares at an unfamiliar anatomy. The Senate predictably wanted to send the 4th, 5th, and 6th armadas immediately. Saravan had argued for a delay. He had been partially overruled. A 3-week preparation window was granted. He used every hour of it. He started with what he knew. The shutdown sequences were not weapon signatures. No energy discharge, no projectile impact, no boarding action, no electronic warfare pulse of any known type. The ships hadn't been attacked. They had been interrupted, as if something had reached into their systems with an intimate knowledge of hegemony technology and simply switched them off, which raised an immediate and deeply uncomfortable question. How did they know how hegemony ships worked? He pulled the records. The first armada had been in the outer system for approximately 4 hours before the shutdowns began. 800 ships over 2 subsequent missions had provided, collectively, about 9 hours of total operational exposure. 9 hours was not enough time to reverse engineer hegemony technology from scratch. Not for any known civilization. Not for anything hegemony science could model. Unless they weren't working from scratch. Saravan sat up in his chair at 3:40 on the 4th sleepless night and stayed very still for 17 minutes. Then he called his intelligence chief, Admiral Preth, and asked one question. "How long have humans been receiving our electromagnetic signals?" Preth checked, came back 40 minutes later with an answer that made Saravan close his eyes. approximately 90 human years. Their receivers aren't purpose-built. They're the same instruments they use for astronomy. But the outer reaches of hegemony space have been leaking navigational signals, maintenance broadcasts, and low-grade administrative transmissions for centuries. Humans have been receiving garbled fragments of hegemony communications for nearly 100 years without knowing what they were. 100 years. 100 years of fragments, static, mathematical ghosts, and a species that apparently treated incomprehensible incoming data as a puzzle to be solved rather than noise to be filtered. Saravan stared at the ceiling of his study for a long time. He thought about what a species would become if it spent a century unknowingly receiving fragments of an alien civilization's technical communications and treating those fragments as a problem to be decoded. If it applied its full scientific apparatus to that problem, year after year, generation after generation, not even knowing what it was working on, building mathematical frameworks to interpret patterns that had no reference point in any human science. Developing, accidentally, an increasingly detailed picture of how a technology they'd never seen actually worked. He thought about what it meant that humanity had apparently succeeded at that problem. He thought about the fact that no one in the hegemony had ever thought to encrypt routine navigational signals because, in 11,000 years, it had never mattered. Who would intercept them? Who would have the mathematical sophistication to decode them without already being part of the hegemony? It was like leaving your house unlocked because you lived on a mountain no one could climb. Except someone had climbed it, quietly, over 100 years, one handhold at a time. Saravan's 3 armadas, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, 900 ships total, launched from hegemony space with modifications that had never been applied to warships before. Signal-isolated hulls, independently powered subsystems with physical disconnects, manual overrides for every automated function. He had also, for the first time in hegemony military history, ordered his ships to travel with active scanning arrays pointed inward as well as outward, monitoring their own systems in real time for any unauthorized access. It didn't help. He got closer than anyone before him. His formation made it to the Mars corridor, well inside the previous 2 fleets' failure points, before his early warning systems began singing. But he caught something the others hadn't. A brief fractional window of data before the access began long enough for his dedicated monitoring systems to log a signature. Not a weapon, not a broadcast, something more precise, more intimate. Something that was physically touching his ship systems through a medium his science couldn't immediately name. He transmitted to the hegemony immediately. "We are not dealing with primitives. Halt all further fleet preparations until I report further." 3 hours later, his 900 ships went dark. He was the only commander to have predicted it. Predicting it did not stop it. He sat in the dark on his silent bridge and did something none of his predecessors had done. He didn't try to restore power. He didn't order manual operations. He reached into his personal kit, pulled out a small illumination tool, battery-powered, completely isolated from ship systems, and he sat in its small, warm light and began writing by hand on actual physical paper. He wrote everything he deduced, everything he suspected, everything that frightened him and everything that impressed him. He wrote for 11 hours, filling 34 pages in his precise, cramped script. When the ship's power was restored 6 days later, slowly, gently, system by system, in an order that suggested whoever was doing it had a more detailed knowledge of hegemony ship architecture than most hegemony engineers, Saravan transmitted one thing to the Senate before anything else. Not a battle report, not a status update. 34 pages of handwritten analysis, scanned and transmitted at maximum compression. The Senate received it, read it, and for the first time in living memory, the chamber's leading faction, the Hawks who had voted for every fleet, went quiet for an entire session without a single speech. The 34th page ended with one paragraph that would later be quoted in history books across multiple civilizations. "I have spent my career studying how civilizations break. I have never studied one that was built from the ground up on the premise that something exactly like us was coming. These humans have not been defending themselves. They have been waiting for us. The distinction matters more than any weapon, any fleet size, or any strategic calculation we could bring to bear. You cannot surprise a civilization that has spent a century dreaming of your arrival. You can only walk into the story they already wrote. 11 months. 11 months of silence from the inner system. No transmissions from Earth. No threats, no demands, no diplomatic overtures. 3 hegemony fleets sat disabled in the outer reaches of a minor star system, their crews alive and fed and completely unable to do anything about it, while their empire argued furiously about what to do next. The Senate sessions during those 11 months were the most fractious in 3 centuries. The Hawks, led by the ancient and formidable Senator Vorathkine, a being who had personally overseen the absorption of 7 civilizations and considered mercy a form of strategic weakness, argued for a response of overwhelming unprecedented force. Not 200 ships, not 600, not 900, everything. The full hegemony war fleet, 12,000 vessels, directed at one small blue world. Burn the atmosphere if necessary, sterilize the surface. Make an example that would echo across the galaxy for 10,000 years. The Cautionaries, a loose coalition that had tripled in size since Sarevon's 34-page report, argued that this approach had a flaw. They had already sent overwhelming force. 1,700 ships sitting disabled in a foreign star system was a fairly emphatic demonstration that more ships was not the relevant variable. And then there was Prex. Junior intelligence analyst Prex was 26 standard years old, the youngest person ever assigned to the Senate Intelligence Directorate, a position he had obtained through a combination of prodigious analytical ability and the kind of social obliviousness that meant he said true things out loud regardless of who was in the room. He had been assigned, somewhat dismissively, to analyze human cultural data, the century of electromagnetic leakage that Sarevon had identified. Radio, television, digital networks. He was expected to compile a threat assessment profile and deliver it in standard format within 30 days. He delivered it in 19 days. It was 847 pages long. The cover sheet said simply, "I think we have made a categorical error in how we have classified this species." He was summoned before the full Intelligence Directorate, which was unusual for an analyst of his rank, which meant people had actually read it. He stood before 12 of the most powerful intelligence minds in the hegemony and explained, with the calm precision of someone who had stopped being nervous after page 40 of writing and had started being excited, what he had found in a century of human signals. He had found stories. Not records, not technical manuals, not government communications or military dispatches, though those were there too. What dominated human electromagnetic output across every medium, across every decade, in every language on the planet was fiction, made-up stories, invented scenarios, and a statistically extraordinary percentage of those invented scenarios, he had run the numbers 4 times to be sure, featured an alien civilization arriving to conquer Earth. "They have been writing this story," Prex told the Directorate, his voice very steady, "for 112 years. They have imagined us, specifically, an empire arriving from space to absorb them in thousands of iterations. They have explored every strategic possibility. They have examined every weakness, every psychological lever, every point of failure that such an empire might have. They have written stories where they win, stories where they lose, stories where it's complicated, and stories where the humans and the empire eventually find a third way." He looked around the room. They called it science fiction. They did not know it was wargaming, but it was. It was the most extensive, most creative, most emotionally invested strategic wargame ever conducted by any species in recorded hegemony history, and they ran it continuously for over a century in full public view, openly, with their entire civilization participating. The room was silent. "And then we arrived," Prex said, "and we were exactly what they had written. On Earth, Elena Vasquez was using the 11 months differently. She was sleeping 4 hours a night, which her doctor described as medically insufficient, and she described as a personal choice. The rest of the time she was building, planning, rehearsing, and most importantly, thinking about what came after. It was easy to plan for the next fleet. She had a system now. It worked. She was confident in it with a coldness that surprised her that she occasionally examined late at night and decided was not arrogance but simply mathematics. She had done the analysis. She understood the mechanism. She could neutralize any fleet the hegemony sent, up to a size that was theoretically possible but practically impossible to organize quickly. What she couldn't stop thinking about was what she did with neutralized fleets. She had 1,700 alien warships sitting in her solar system, crewed by living beings from dozens of species, and she was feeding them and keeping them alive, and at some point she was going to have to make a decision about what this situation actually was. Because if it was a war, she wasn't fighting it right. And if it wasn't a war, she needed to give it a name. She took long walks through the mountain facility at night. The corridors were always staffed. The UEDC ran 24 hours, and people nodded as she passed, or stood a little straighter, or quietly found something to look at on their screens. She'd learned to walk the back corridors where she could think without performing. She stopped outside the facility's small library, a room she'd insisted on including when they were building the place, over the objection of 3 different generals who thought it was a waste of space, and stood in the doorway looking at the shelves. Science fiction, history, philosophy, military theory. She'd read most of it over the years in whatever fragments of time were available. She'd read it the way soldiers often read, not for pleasure exactly, but because fiction was the only place where you could run scenarios all the way to the end, all the way to the part where you found out if the decision you made in the middle was the right one. She pulled a paperback from the shelf, an old one, the spine held together with careful tape, and read the cover. A novel she'd read 3 times, a story about first contact. One of the 1,000 iterations Prex was documenting on the other side of the galaxy without knowing Alina existed. She put it back on the shelf. They've been writing this story for 100 years, she thought. Now I have to write the ending they deserve. She went back to work. The Hawks won. It was not a clean vote. It was the kind of vote that happens when an institution has argued itself into exhaustion and someone finally forces a decision. 6,847 senators for, 5,203 against, with 412 abstentions from senators who had apparently decided that history would judge them less harshly for silence than for either choice. The cautionaries argued until the last moment. Prex submitted a supplementary report that was tabled without being read, which meant it was received and filed and ignored, which was bureaucratically speaking the same as throwing it away, except it provided deniability. The motion passed. The 7th and 8th Armadas would launch. But even the Hawks had been listening, after a fashion. The new fleets were not the same as their predecessors. Battle Priest Mordoth had spent the 11 months of silence doing what Saravan had done, studying. But where Saravan had emerged with respect and apprehension, Mordoth had emerged with a list of countermeasures and a theology of inevitability. He was a being who genuinely believed, with the complete sincerity of someone who had never once been wrong about anything important, that the hegemony's expansion was the natural order of the universe, and that any deviation from it was a temporary and correctable error. His ships had new hulls, layered in signal isolation composites developed by the hegemony's top engineers working around the clock for 4 months. His crews had been briefed extensively on human psychological warfare, because Mordoth had decided the key vulnerability wasn't technological. It was behavioral. The humans were using their opponents' hesitation and moral confusion against them, and Mordoth felt himself to be a being entirely immune to hesitation and moral confusion. Every system on his ships had been physically isolated with mechanical cutoffs that could not be accessed remotely. Power routing ran through analog switches that required physical hands to operate. He had personally supervised the modification of 900 warships and pronounced himself satisfied. He launched with 900 ships, in 9 columns of 100, and crossed the heliopause with the absolute certainty of a man who has prepared correctly and whose God is watching. Alina Vasquez watched him come for 6 days before she called her team together. "He's done the work," she said, standing at the head of the table with her hands flat on its surface, looking at the approach trajectories. "These ships are different from the others. The isolation composites are going to slow us down significantly, and the analog cutoffs mean our standard sequence won't work the same way." "Can we still stop them?" Marcus Webb asked. "Yes," she said it without hesitation. "Just not the same way. We adapt." Dr. Osai spent 36 hours developing modifications. The isolation composites were effective against the primary access method, but not against a secondary approach that Amara had been sitting on for months, waiting for precisely this kind of escalation. Alina had insisted from the beginning that every capability they revealed should be the minimum necessary, never showing the full hand, always keeping something back, not for theatrics, for exactly this moment. "He's protected himself against what we did before," Amara said during the briefing, pulling up schematics. "But he's protected himself against what he knows we did. He doesn't know about this." She highlighted a section of the approach model. "Here, we let him cross Jupiter, let him feel good about how far he's gotten, and then we use the secondary method. It's slower, takes about 4 hours for the full fleet instead of 40 minutes, but it works." "What about the analog cutoffs?" someone asked. Amara smiled in the way that scientists smile when they've been waiting to reveal something. "The analog cutoffs require physical hands, so we use physical systems." She pulled up a different screen. "The gravity modification array, Not our technology, strictly speaking, it's derived from their navigational signal data, but we've built it ourselves. It creates localized gravitational anomalies around individual ships, not enough to damage them, enough to make their own components shift. She paused. The analog switches are physical. Gravity is also physical. A switch that requires a hand to stay in position doesn't stay in position if the hand, and everything around it, is subject to repeated microgravitational fluctuations. The room was quiet for a moment. "We're going to shake their switches loose," said a junior officer slowly. "With orbital mechanics," Amara confirmed pleasantly. Elena looked at the screens for a long moment. Then, "How long before the first ships reach Jupiter?" 31 hours. "Then we have 31 hours to make sure we're ready, because this time I want something different at the end." She turned to face her communications team. "When the last ship goes dark, I want Mordoth's personal channel open. Immediately, no delay. I want to be talking to him before he's had time to process what's happened." "What are we going to say?" Marcus asked. Elena thought about the paperback with the taped spine. About 100 years of stories about this exact moment. About what the humans always did in the good endings and what they always did in the bad ones, and how the difference was never about weapons. "The truth," she said. "For the first time, we're going to tell him the actual truth." Mordoth's fleet crossed Jupiter's orbit at 8:47 Earth Standard Time. He felt good, his systems were clean, his signals were isolated, his analog cutoffs were engaged, he had done everything right. He broadcast to his fleet, "Forward, maintain formation, we will not stop this time." For 27 minutes, nothing happened. 27 minutes was long enough for Mordoth to start feeling something he would never have named aloud. Something warm and victorious beginning to build in his chest. He watched his instruments functioning, all of them perfectly clean, and he allowed himself privately the beginning of a smile. Then the microfluctuations began. They were subtle at first, instrument tremors that his engineers dismissed as local gravitational variants, then less subtle. Then his flagship shuddered, a long, low vibration that traveled through the hull like a breath. And one by one, across the fleet, physical switches that had been manually engaged began to disengage, and systems that had been isolated began to reconnect. And the access that his composites had blocked found new pathways through the infrastructure he had exposed by trying to protect himself. It took 4 hours and 17 minutes. At the end of it, 900 ships drifted silent in the inner system, and Mordoth sat alone on his dark bridge with the particular stillness of a man who has prepared for every possibility except being wrong. A light on his communications panel came on. A human woman looked at him from the screen. Dark hair, tired eyes, the same woman Draxus had described, the same calm, the same patience. "Battle Priest Mordoth," she said. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I command Earth's defense. I've been watching you come for 6 days. She paused. "I want you to understand something before I say anything else. Every single member of your crew is alive. Every life support system on every one of your 900 ships is running. We have been sustaining your people at our own resource cost since the moment your ships went dark." Another pause. "We have now done this for 1,700 ships over 11 months. We have kept 1,700 warships worth of crews alive without being asked to, without negotiation, without any agreement in place." Mordoth said nothing. His face was very still. "I'm telling you this," Elena continued, "because I need you to understand what we actually are, not a threat, not an obstacle, not a primitive civilization that needs to be absorbed." She leaned forward slightly. "We are a civilization that has been keeping your people alive for nearly a year, and we have not once asked for anything in return. Not surrender, not negotiation, not acknowledgement." She held his gaze. "We've just been taking care of them because that's what we do." Mordoth stared at her for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully level. "What do you want?" "To talk," Elena said. "That's all. I would just like to talk." The first supply shuttle crossed from Earth orbit to the disabled fleet at 600 the following morning. It was not a military vessel. It was a converted cargo hauler, the kind used for orbital station resupply, stripped of weapons, filled with protein packs, water reclamation cartridges, and medical supplies. Elena had personally overseen the manifest. Every item on it had been chosen not just for utility, but for the message it carried in its very plainness. This was not a gesture of generosity from a position of dominance. This was a neighbor bringing food to someone who needed it, without ceremony, without expectation. Mordoth, watching from his dark bridge as the shuttle docked with his flagship, did not know what to do with this. He had spent 48 hours in the dark constructing psychological frameworks for what came next. He had prepared for demands, for ultimatums, for the slow theater of negotiated surrender that his own empire had performed 63 times with civilizations it had defeated. He knew exactly what conquerors did when they won because he had been a conqueror for most of his professional life. He did not know what to do with protein packs and a maintenance drone that arrived with his forward section's life support array and began, without being asked, optimizing its efficiency by 12%. He called Vorath Keen on his emergency encrypted channel. "They are feeding us," he said. There was a long silence from the Senate's most powerful hawk. "Feeding you," Senator Vorath Keen repeated. "And repairing our life support systems, without asking for anything." Mordoth paused. "Senator, I have faced 38 military engagements. I have studied the defeat postures of 47 civilizations. I have never encountered a victor who responded to success by improving the loser's oxygen supply." Another pause. "I don't have a doctrine for this." Vorath Keen didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had the particular quality of someone rearranging something fundamental in their mind in real time. "Mordoth, are they trying to demonstrate that we are dependent on their goodwill?" "Possibly, but if so, it's the most expensive and inconvenient way to make that point that I can conceive of." He watched another supply drone exit the shuttle's bay on his monitors. "Or they actually just, he stopped. "What?" "They actually just care whether we live," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth, not because they were difficult, but because they were so simple. "They actually care whether 1,700 enemy warships worth of enemy soldiers live or die, with no strategic calculation attached to it. I've been looking for the calculation for 2 days, and I cannot find it." The silence from Vorath Keen lasted a long time. "Then they are either the most sophisticated manipulators in the galaxy," she said finally, "or they are something we do not have a category for." Elena Vasquez stood before the Joint Command at 1400 that day and received the full force of their displeasure. They were not wrong exactly. She understood their position perfectly. The UEDC had suffered casualties in the early warning phases, 17 people in forward observation posts that had been unmanned but whose automated systems had been destroyed, 2 survey teams in the outer system that had gone silent before Elena had her countermeasures fully operational, 17 names on a wall in the facilities corridor. She passed them every morning. She read each one. General Webb led the objection. He was calm about it, which made it worse than shouting. He stood at his end of the table and said, "We have now committed significant ongoing resources to sustaining the forces that were sent to conquer us. We have received nothing in return. We have demonstrated extraordinary capability and extraordinary restraint simultaneously, which is either the most powerful diplomatic signal in history or the biggest mistake we've ever made. And I would like to understand which one it is before we continue." "It's both," Elena said. Silence. "It's both," she repeated, "and that's not a problem, that's the point." She stood up and walked to the window. There was a narrow window in the briefing room, high up, showing a strip of gray mountain sky. She looked at it for a moment. Every civilization in history that has ever won something has then had to decide what to do with the winning. And the ones that decided to simply extract everything they could, they won and then they won again and again until they stopped winning. And by then they'd made so many enemies on the way that the stopping was catastrophic. She turned around. And the ones that decided to treat the winning as a beginning of something rather than an end, those are the ones that built things that lasted. "This is not a philosophy seminar, Elena," said Admiral Hortense Quame from the far end of the table. "No," Elena agreed. "It's a practical calculation. We have 1,700 warships worth of hegemony military personnel alive and conscious and watching everything we do. They will eventually return to their empire. What they tell the Senate when they get there is the most important intelligence operation in human history, and we are writing what they say right now with every protein pack and every repair drone." She looked around the room. "I want them to go home and tell the Senate that Earth is the most terrifying thing they've ever encountered, and also the safest place they've ever been. I want those 2 things to exist in their minds simultaneously, forever, irreconcilably. Because a civilization that can hold both of those thoughts at once about us will never, ever decide that attacking us again is worth it." The room was quiet for a moment. "And if they decide it is worth it anyway?" Webb asked. "Then we do this again," Elena said simply. "But they won't." She looked at the strip of gray sky in the window. They won't, she said again, quieter, not performing certainty this time, just certain. In his dark cabin on a dark ship in the silence of the inner solar system, Battle Priest Mordoth sat with a protein pack in his hands and thought about the hegemony's divine mandate of galactic order. He thought about it for a long time. He ate the protein pack. He thought some more. He had spent his life believing that the strong organized the weak because organization was the natural expression of strength. He believed this genuinely, not cynically. He had seen disorder, the chaos of pre-absorption civilizations, the suffering that came from fragmentation, the wars that small civilizations fought among themselves, and he had seen the hegemony bring order to that disorder, and had genuinely believed that the order was good. He still believed that order was good. He was just no longer certain that the hegemony was the strongest thing in this system. And for the first time, sitting in the quiet dark while an alien civilization's repair drones optimized his oxygen supply, he found himself wondering what it might look like. Not as a defeat, not as a surrender, but as a genuine intellectual exercise, if the strongest thing decided what order looked like. He finished the protein pack. In the morning, he asked to speak to Elena Vasquez again. Nobody knew about it. That was the point. The Ninth Fleet, if a single, unarmed, modified colony transport could be called a fleet, had been dispatched 17 months before the 7th and 8th Armadas launched, by a group of 11 senators who had not voted for any of the military campaigns, had watched the Hawks win every vote, and had come to a private conclusion so bleak that they discussed it only in person, in a single room, with every recording device physically removed. Their conclusion was this: the hegemony might not survive contact with Earth. Not militarily, politically. The fractures the Earth campaign was creating, the debates, the cautionary movement, the species within the hegemony who were watching humanity's resistance with expressions that looked uncomfortably like inspiration, those fractures were deepening with every fleet that went silent. Civilizations that had been absorbed 2 centuries ago were asking questions they hadn't asked in generations. Junior members of the Senate were citing Sarevon's 34 pages in floor debates. Prex's 847-page report had been tabled, but it had been copied and distributed, and it was circulating through the hegemony's intellectual communities like a slow fire. The 11 senators did not know what the end of this looked like, but they were historians, all of them, and they knew what the beginning of institutional collapse looked like, and they were looking at it. So they had done something that no senator had done in 1,000 years. They had acted unilaterally. The ship was called the Remembrance. It was registered as a deep space survey vessel and carried no weapons, no military designation, no formal hegemony authority. What it carried was 40,000 civilians, families mostly, academics, historians, artists, medical professionals. Children, many of them 11,000 children, the youngest of whom was 4 months old. It also carried in a specially constructed archive core the complete cultural records of every civilization the hegemony had ever absorbed. Every language, every art form, every story, every song. The records that official hegemony archives kept in redacted, sanitized form, the actual records, unfiltered. The captain was Solène Voth, 63 years old, a retired imperial archivist who had spent 4 decades quietly preserving records that her superiors had marked for deletion. She had gray hair, a deliberate manner, and a piece of paper in her personal effects that she'd read every morning for the past 17 months. It was a note from the 11 senators, handwritten, unsigned, saying, "If the fleets fail, find a place, any place where these things can survive, and do not come back until it is safe for them." The Remembrance had been traveling slowly, taking the long route, staying off major transit corridors. It crossed into the solar system's outer edge on a trajectory that would, eventually, bring it to the inner system, but slowly, quietly, in the shadow of larger bodies, like something that had learned to move carefully through uncertain territory. Solène sat on the bridge and watched her navigation charts and thought about her 40,000 people sleeping in the ship's residential sections, and the 11,000 children who had grown up on this ship, not quite understanding where they were going or why, only knowing that the adults around them were very careful and very determined, and that they were, in some way they couldn't articulate, looking for something. She hadn't told them what she would do if Earth was not safe. She didn't have an answer for that yet. Elena's long-range array found the Remembrance at 11:47 on a Tuesday. The duty officer who flagged it had already run the preliminary scans by the time Elena arrived at the sensor station. She stood over his shoulder and looked at the data for a full 2 minutes without saying anything. No weapons signatures, the officer said. No military drive configuration. It's actually using a slower, older drive system. The hull's civilian grade. And the interior mass distribution is, he frowned at the screen. It reads like residential. Lots of biological signatures, lots of small ones. Children, Alina said. He looked up at her. The small biological signatures, she said. They're children. She stared at the screen. Behind her, her tactical officer was already pulling up firing solutions, automatic protocol, unknown vessel, inner system approach, standard procedure, the right procedure. Stand down the weapons lock, Alina said quietly. Admiral, protocol requires. I know what protocol requires, Alina said, still looking at the screen. Stand it down. She pulled up the manifest data, fragmentary, based on scan readings, but enough. The archive core signature was massive and distinctive. She'd been briefed on hegemony archival formats months ago when her intelligence teams had started pulling apart the signal data. She recognized what she was looking at. A library. A library the size of a starship, carrying 40,000 people and 11,000 children to a place they'd been told might be safe. She opened a channel, not a tactical channel, not a defense protocol channel, the regular communications array, the kind you used for neighbors. Attention unidentified vessel, she said. This is Captain Alina Vasquez of the Unified Earth Defense Command. We have you on sensors. You are unarmed and we have confirmed civilian population aboard. She paused. You don't have to be afraid. We can see what you are. Please respond. The response took 4 minutes. It was audio only, a woman's voice, older, steady, with the particular calm of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a specific moment and has fully accepted that it might not come. Captain Vasquez, said Solen Voth. My name is Solen. I am carrying 40,000 people and the histories of every civilization your visitors have ever absorbed. I was told to find a safe place. A pause. I would very much like to ask if this is one. Alina looked at the screen for a moment, looked at the mass distribution reading, looked at the 11,000 small biological signatures. Yes, she said, it is. She turned to her communications officer. Get me a landing authority for the southern continent. Clear the civilian zone. She turned back to the screen. Solen, we have a lot of empty continent. We're going to bring you in. She heard something in the following silence that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not crying, not relief exactly. Something quieter. The sound of 40,000 people's worth of held breath finally being let go. The remembrance landed in the grasslands of what had been Patagonia. The children came out first. Children always did, Solen had noticed, across every civilization she'd studied. They came through the doors before the adults had fully decided it was safe, because children processed safety differently, not through analysis but through instinct, through the smell of air and the feeling of ground, through the completely neuronic fact that the sun was warm and the grass was real, and whatever this place was, it had weather and it had light, and it was not the inside of a ship. Alina stood 50 meters from the landing ramp with a small team and watched them come. A 4-year-old ran into the grass and fell down and laughed. A group of older children, maybe 8 or 9, stood at the edge of the landing ramp and looked at the sky, a sky bigger and more immediate than anything they'd seen through a viewport, and one of them held another one's hand very tight. Solen came down the ramp last. She was smaller than Alina had expected. She walked with a slight limp, old injury, never properly treated, and she carried a single bag over one shoulder and a data pad in her hand that she held the way people hold things they cannot afford to put down. She stopped in front of Alina. They looked at each other. You kept them alive, Solen said, not the disabled fleets. She meant her own people. We haven't done anything yet, Alina said. You just got here. No, Solen said. I mean, you could have fired on us the moment we crossed the heliopause. Every protocol your civilization and mine would recognize would have supported that decision. Unknown vessel, potential threat, easy calculation. She held Alina's gaze. You didn't. Alina said nothing. Why? Solen asked. Alina was quiet for a moment. Out in the grass, the 4-year-old was now pulling up handfuls of Patagonian dirt and examining it with the intense scientific focus of someone encountering a new element. Because they were children, Alina said. Solen looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the data pad she'd been carrying and handed it to Alina. It was the archive index. Hundreds of thousands of entries. Languages and music and histories and stories from 47 civilizations, preserved by one tired archivist who had believed they were worth keeping. "I'd like to show you what we brought," Solen said, "if you have time." Alina looked at the index, then at the grassland full of children, then back at Solen. "I have time," she said. Prex arrived on Earth on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. He came alone, which was unprecedented, for a hegemony diplomatic mission. He had no security detail, no protocol officers, no cultural liaison. He carried one bag and a data chip containing his 1,100 pages of accumulated analysis, and he stepped off the shuttle at the UEDC landing facility looking slightly overwhelmed by the quality of the light. He had never seen a sky that color before. The particular blue of Earth's atmosphere, the specific thin, vivid, oxygen-rich blue that came from a combination of factors unique to this world, stopped him at the bottom of the ramp for nearly a full minute. Alina was waiting for him. "It's brighter than I expected," he said. "We get that a lot," she said. She had a car waiting, a real car, ground level, nothing aerial, because Prex had mentioned in his communications that he wanted to see Earth, not fly over it. She drove him herself. No driver, no escort. Just the two of them moving through mountain roads in the early morning and Prex watching the world go by with the quiet, enormous attention of someone who has been studying something their whole life and is now, finally, seeing it in person. He had requested 3 months. The Senate had given him 90 days to deliver his final assessment, a diplomatic position paper that would determine the hegemony's posture toward Earth for the foreseeable future. The Hawks expected a tactical vulnerability report and a recommended path to eventual absorption by less direct means. The cautionaries expected a recommendation for formal disengagement. The 11 senators who had sent Solen expected. They weren't sure what they expected. Something true. The 3 months were not what Prex had expected either. He had expected to conduct analysis, to observe, document, categorize. He had expected Earth to be a subject and himself to be a scientist, and the 90 days to be a structured process of data collection that would result in a clean, professional report. Instead, Alina Vasquez took him to see things. Not military installations, not government facilities. She took him to a school in a small city in what she called Japan, where children were learning mathematics by building physical structures out of wood and watching them fail. She took him to a hospital in a country called Brazil and introduced him to a surgeon who was working on a technique that translated hegemony medical data from Solen's archive into practical surgical methods for human physiology. She took him to a concert hall in a city called Vienna, where an orchestra played music that had been written 2 centuries ago by a man who was deaf when he wrote it. Prex sat in the concert hall and listened to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and 3/4 of the way through the final movement he stopped taking notes entirely and just sat very still with his hands in his lap. He visited memorials. Alina didn't explain them at first. She let him read the inscriptions, look at the names, understand on his own. He stood for a long time in front of a black granite wall in a country called America, reading 58,000 individual names carved in stone. "This is from a war?" he asked. "Yes." "A war you fought among yourselves?" "Yes." "And you built a memorial for the people who died in it?" "We build memorials for all of them," Alina said. "The ones who died in wars we were right to fight and wars we were wrong to fight. The ones who died fighting for things that turned out to be wrong. All of them." Prex stood at the wall for a very long time. "We do not do this," he said eventually. "When the hegemony absorbs a civilization and there are casualties, the records are adjusted, simplified. We note a transition period and catalog the civilization's integration into the hegemony framework." He paused. "We do not put up walls with their names." "I know," Alina said. "Why do you?" he asked. Alina thought about it for a moment. "Because forgetting is how you repeat it," she said. "And we have repeated it enough already. The wall is a promise. It doesn't always work, but you make the promise anyway." On the 61st day, Prex asked Alina the question he'd been constructing for weeks. They were sitting on a low sea wall above a beach in a country called Portugal. Alina had suggested it, said she needed to be near the ocean periodically, that it was a personal requirement she'd identified sometime around age 12 and had never successfully explained. The sun was going down in a way that was, Prex had to admit, genuinely extraordinary. "I have been trying to understand something for the entire time I've been here," he said. "About how you stopped us." He looked at the water. "The technology I understand, the derivation of our own signals, the access methods, that's comprehensible. That's intelligence work, very good intelligence work." He paused. What I don't understand is the choice. Elena looked at him. You could have destroyed those ships, Prex said. The first armada, you could have annihilated them before they even reached Saturn. Your systems were capable of it. Instead, you disabled them and kept every crew member alive. And then you fed them. And then you fed the next 1,600 ships worth of crews as well. He looked at her directly. No civilization I have ever studied, and I have studied hundreds, would have made that choice. A threatened civilization destroys the threat. It's the only rational response to existential danger. Is it? Elena asked. Statistically and historically, yes. Prex, Elena said. What's the difference between a civilization and an empire? He blinked. I'm not sure Empire, Elena said, takes what it needs and defends what it has, and that's it. That's the whole operational definition. It expands until it can't anymore, and then it holds, and then it contracts. She looked at the water. A civilization does something else. A civilization asks what it is, not just what it has. It argues about it. It writes stories about it. It builds walls with the names of its mistakes so it doesn't forget what it is capable of. She was quiet for a moment. We have been both throughout our history. We have been empires, terrible ones, some of them. We know what it looks like. She looked at him. We are trying right now at this specific moment in our history to be a civilization. And one of the things a civilization does, one of the difficult things, is decide that what it does with power matters more than whether it has power. Prex was quiet for a long time. That is the hardest thing I have ever been asked to take seriously, he said finally. I know, Elena said. I think I might actually believe it. I know that too, she said. That's why I brought you to Portugal. Prex returned to the Senate on day 90. He stood before 12,000 senators. He looked out at the faces of 47 species, the faces of a civilization that had organized the galaxy for 11,000 years according to principles it had never questioned because no one had ever been powerful enough to make it. He had written his report. It was 23 pages, the shortest document he had ever produced. The Senate expected a tactical assessment, expected vulnerabilities, recommended approaches, proposed pathways. He folded his 23 pages and put them in his pocket. He stood at the podium for a long moment in silence, looking at the chamber, looking at the carved faces on the walls, the 47 species, frozen in expressions the architects had chosen to read as gratitude. He thought about the wall in America with 58,000 names. He thought about the children running into Patagonian grass. He thought about Beethoven's Ninth, written in deafness heard across centuries. He thought about Elena Vasquez sitting on a sea wall in Portugal, watching the sun go down, saying that's why I brought you to Portugal with the certainty of someone who had known, from the beginning, that this was the conversation the whole thing had been building toward. He looked at the Senate. Do not go back, he said. 4 words, into the largest legislative chamber in the known galaxy, into the silence that followed them, a silence that was not the silence of anger or disbelief, but something stranger and more complicated. The silence of an institution that has, for the first time in its existence, been told something it doesn't know how to argue against. He waited for the noise to begin. It didn't, not immediately. I have walked on Earth for 90 days, he said into the continuing silence. I have seen what they are, I have read what they've written, I have heard what they've made. He paused. We sent 9 fleets to that world because we believed strength was the organizing principle of the universe. They stopped 9 fleets and fed our soldiers because they believed something different. He looked around the chamber. And I am standing here in front of you telling you that their belief is correct, not because I have converted to a philosophy, but because I am an analyst and the evidence is unambiguous. Another pause. We are the strongest military force in this galaxy, and they stopped us. Not with greater weapons, with greater purpose, with the conviction that what you do with power is the definition of what you are. He looked at the Hawk faction. We cannot absorb that, we cannot fight it. We cannot outlast it. He looked at the cautionaries. We can possibly learn it. He took his 23-page report out of his pocket and set it on the podium. My assessment is in the document, he said. My recommendation is the 4 words I already gave you. He picked up his bag. I resign my position effective immediately. I have asked Captain Vasquez for permission to return to Earth, and she has given it. He paused one final time. She said, and I want the record to include this exactly, she said. We have a lot of empty continent, and Solen's going to need help with the archive. He left the podium. The chamber was quiet for a long time. In the UEDC's deep storage archives, in a server room in a Swiss mountain that officially didn't exist, a bureaucratic system logged the final entry in a file labeled Hegemony Contact. Case 7714C. 9 fleets dispatched by the Galactic hegemony. Total vessel count 1,700. Total personnel approximately 2.3 million. Casualties 0. 1 message returned. 4 words. The system's automated classification algorithm, designed by committee to categorize outcomes in binary terms, processed the data for 0.003 seconds, and filed the case under its default category for any engagement where hostile forces were neutralized without loss of life on either side. Inconclusive. Elena Vasquez, walking past the server room on her nightly round at 200, stopped, opened the terminal, found the file, and changed the classification manually. She typed 1 word. Victory. Then she thought for a moment, deleted it, and typed something else. Beginning. She closed the terminal. Outside, in the Patagonian grasslands, 11,000 children who had grown up looking for a place to land were sleeping under an earth sky for the 61st consecutive night. In Vienna, a hegemony musician who had come on the Remembrance and heard Beethoven for the first time was sitting at a piano in a rented room at 200, playing the same 12 bars over and over with the concentration of someone learning a new language. In Portugal, the seawall was empty, but the sun would come back. In a galaxy of 11,000 star systems and 47 known civilizations, word was traveling, slowly, the way true things travel, that somewhere on the outer spiral arm, a small blue world had done something that had no name in any existing language. They would need to invent one.